Europe's reputation as the world's cleanest continent just collapsed. Transparency International's 2026 Corruption Index puts Western Europe at its lowest in a decade, with the UK plummeting 12 points to a record low score of 70. But this isn't about backroom bribes and brown envelopes. The new corruption is legal, professional, and wrapped in consulting contracts, insider appointments, and advisory gigs for retired power brokers. Who is the government working for? Voters or donors? Peel back the facade of transparency, and what you find is a continent deep in institutionalized state capture. How did rulers who promised integrity create a system that turns democracy into a business? The numbers do not lie, even when politicians do. Transparency International's latest Corruption Perceptions Index puts Western Europe at a flat line, 64 out of 100. That is not just a slip, it is a decade low. For years, the region sold itself as the gold standard, rules-based, scandal-proof, a continent of clean hands. Now the data tells a different story. 13 out of 20 Western European countries have seen their scores drop since 2012. Only 7 managed to improve, most by a hair. The UK, once paraded as a model, now sits at 70, down 12 points since 2017. That is the sharpest drop of any major democracy in the region. France, too, is stuck in reverse, clinging to a score of 66 as enforcement flounders and official private collusion becomes routine. Even Denmark, the perennial top scorer, cannot mask the rot spreading across the continent. The methodology behind these scores is not guesswork. It is a composite of 13 expert and business surveys, each one measuring the lived reality of public sector corruption, including lobbying opacity, procurement rigging, finance loopholes, and the revolving door between government and industry. A perfect score is 100. 0 means total state capture. Western Europe used to hover near 75. Now, the region is closer to 64 and falling. The myth of the clean north is cracking. The supposed guardians of transparency are losing ground to the same forces they once condemned in the east: opaque lobbying, unchecked donor influence, and the normalization of access for cash politics. The numbers are a ledger of institutional decay. They do not just reveal a slide, they demand an explanation. If the continent built on integrity is slipping, what is really happening behind the scenes? Who benefits as the scores drop and the old certainties die? Peter Mandelson's name is stamped across the access ledger of Britain's political elite. The official story is polished: former business secretary, EU commissioner, Labour grandee. The real story is encrypted in a string of bank transfers, leaked emails, and a paper trail that runs straight through the House of Lords. In January 2026, a tranche of Epstein documents lands in the public domain. The figures are not rumors. $75,000 in payments, 2 commercial flights covered by Epstein in 2003, a $4,000 monthly stipend to Mandelson's husband routed through shadow accounts. The emails aren't idle chatter. On March 31, 2010, Mandelson receives confidential Treasury minutes. 5 minutes later, he forwards them to Epstein. The next day, he does the same with notes from a closed-door meeting between UK and US finance chiefs. On May 9, 2010, he tips off Epstein about a €500 billion EU bailout, hours before the news shakes the markets. The leaks include Downing Street memos, asset sale plans, and even details of a tunnel running beneath Whitehall. Each timestamp is a fingerprint, every document a breach. By February 2026, the Metropolitan Police formally announce a criminal investigation into misconduct in public office. Mandelson resigns from both the Labour Party and the Lords. The consultancy he co-founded, Global Counsel, scrambles to cut ties as clients panic over reputational risk. Gordon Brown, whose own government secrets were passed to a convicted sex offender, calls it a betrayal with huge commercial damage. The Register of Interests, meant to guarantee transparency, reads like a menu of plausible deniability. Advisory roles for foreign state-linked firms, retained access to government corridors, and a decades-long pattern of monetizing inside knowledge. The question isn't whether Mandelson broke the rules. The question is what rules ever really existed. In a system that hands out privilege and access as currency, where does the line between public service and private profit even run? The ledger is public now, but the rot was always institutional. On a grey Thursday morning in March 2025, Belgian federal police fanned out across Brussels, Flanders, and Wallonia. 21 addresses were hit at once. They included offices, apartments, and the back rooms of shell companies. The warrants named names Valerio Ortati, a former member of the European Parliament turned Huawei lobbyist, and a cluster of intermediaries who had mastered the art of staying just outside the EU Transparency Register. In Portugal, the same playbook played out, with raids targeting consulting firms, legal frontmen, and a handful of ex-officials now drawing retainers from Chinese telecom interests. The pattern was not subtle, it was engineered to be legal. The paperwork behind these searches reads like a manual for laundering influence. Entities flagged in the warrants, half of them never registered on the EU Transparency Register, moved money through consulting contracts, conference sponsorships, and luxury travel disguised as policy briefings. Investigators found signed letters to the European Commission, drafted by lobbyists but fronted by sitting members of the European Parliament, all pushing for Huawei inclusion in 5G rollouts. 8 members of the European Parliament signed one letter, and a trail of payments was routed through at least 3 layers of intermediaries. No brown envelopes, just wire transfers and invoices for strategic advice. Belgian prosecutors charged 15 current and former members of the European Parliament with corruption, forgery, money laundering, and belonging to a criminal organization. Seals went up on 2 parliamentary offices. The evidence haul included encrypted phones, shredded memos, and a spreadsheet mapping 10 million euros in undeclared funds. In France, a European arrest warrant landed one suspect in custody within hours. The official line from Huawei was denial, zero tolerance for bribery, and full cooperation with authorities. But the company's lobbyists had already been banned from Parliament premises months earlier, after intelligence warnings flagged foreign influence operations as a systemic threat. The real lesson was not the size of the bribes, it was the scale of the loopholes. Thousands of lobbyists operate in Brussels. Most never bother to register. The registry is voluntary, the enforcement toothless, and the incentives obvious. If policy can be bought via intermediaries, the only crime is getting caught. The raids made headlines, but the architecture of capture remained untouched, a system designed to look transparent while running on influence for sale. December 2025. The EU's Anti-Corruption Directive was supposed to be the answer, a continent-wide law to force every member state to get serious about influence peddling, revolving doors, and political finance. On paper, the draft was sharp: mandatory transparency for lobbyists, strict conflict of interest rules, and whistleblower protections with real teeth. But in the final council document, the language is gutted. Clauses that once required lobbyists to register and disclose their clients are gone. The word mandatory is replaced by voluntary. Reporting obligations vanish, replaced by vague encouragements to promote integrity. Even the definition of a conflict of interest is narrowed to direct personal gain, letting family members and shell companies off the hook. Council document 14,578/25 reads like a surrender note. The fingerprints of Malta, Hungary, and other golden visa holdouts are everywhere. Meeting minutes show ambassadors arguing that national sovereignty trumps enforcement and that market realities require flexibility. In practice, this means golden passport schemes and cash for residency programs are shielded from scrutiny. The market for European citizenship, already worth billions, gets a fresh green light. just as the directive is signed. Transparency International calls out the farce. Lobbying transparency, conflict of interest rules, and enhanced transparency in political finance regulation are not obligatory. The EU Commission promises progress, but the new law is a paper tiger. The registry for lobbyists remains voluntary. Member states can ignore reporting deadlines with no penalty. The only real obligation left is to write an annual anti-corruption strategy. No enforcement, no sanctions, no accountability. The message is clear. The system is designed to look clean, not to be clean. The directive's dilution isn't a technicality. It is institutional surrender. Corruption isn't hiding in the shadows. It is written into law, protected by the very people who are supposed to fight it. The golden visa market flourishes, and the cost is paid by everyone who still believes in the myth of European integrity. May 2025. The European Court of Justice delivers a verdict that shreds the last fig leaf from the golden passport business. Paragraphs 78 through 82 of the judgment spell it out. Malta's scheme is not just a policy failure, it is illegal under EU law. The court rules that selling citizenship with no real connection to the country undermines the very idea of European rights. Security, trust, and the meaning of union citizenship are all on the line. The text is blunt. Such schemes undermine the genuine enjoyment of rights by union citizens and threaten the security of the union as a whole. The date is stamped. The illegality is clear. Yet the ruling lands with a thud, not a bang. Within weeks, brokers in Spain, Greece, and Portugal are still pitching golden visas to Chinese and Russian investors. The minimums are just numbers: €250,000 in Athens, €500,000 in Madrid. Shell companies and straw buyers keep the money moving, and the business continues as if the judgment never happened. Malta tweaks the paperwork, rebrands, and the cash for passport pipeline stays open for anyone with the right connections. On paper, the law has spoken. In practice, the market for European citizenship is too valuable to kill. The ECJ condemnation is a formal warning, but enforcement is nowhere. The gap between legal proclamations from Brussels and the reality on the ground is now impossible to ignore. The court can declare a practice illegal. It cannot make member states give up the business model. The message to the world is unmistakable. In Europe, even the law is negotiable if the price is right. In Lisbon, a set of court files lays bare the mechanics of Europe's residency for sale racket. Prosecutors trace a money trail of €37 million that starts with golden visa investors, mostly from China and Russia, wired into the accounts of a newly formed Portuguese shell company. On paper, the cash is meant for luxury hotel and apartment projects in the Algarve. In reality, the funds vanish almost instantly through a maze of holding companies, each registered to a different nominee director in Cyprus, Panama, and the British Virgin Islands. Bank subpoenas show the same €37 million reappearing offshore weeks later, split across accounts owned by relatives of former government officials and the lawyers who drafted the original contracts. Accountants hired by the court reconstruct the flow. Investor deposits hit a Lisbon bank, are swept into a local special purpose vehicle, then layered through at least 4 offshore shells before surfacing in a trust controlled by an anonymous foundation. Registry extracts link these shells to politically exposed persons, names that never appear in public filings, but show up in internal audit notes flagged as high risk. The hotel project itself remains a construction site, with no permits, no workers, and no sign of development beyond a glossy brochure circulated at Visa Expos in Shanghai and Moscow. The case file reads like a blueprint for laundering. Every step is legal on paper, engineered by consultants who specialize in compliance. The only thing missing is the promised real estate. For the investors, the golden visa arrives by courier. For the architects of the scheme, the money is already gone, washed clean, moved out of reach, and protected by layers of plausible deniability. Hungary's judiciary didn't fall to corruption in the shadows. It was seized in broad daylight, clause by clause. Act C-Elorsk 7 of 2022, Clause 17, rewrote the rules with bureaucratic precision. The power to appoint, discipline, and promote judges moved from the National Judicial Council to a new office under the direct thumb of the Justice Minister. That shift wasn't about efficiency, it was about control. Overnight, the independence of the courts became a legal fiction. Judges who once answered to their peers now faced a single political boss. The message was unmistakable. Loyalty mattered more than law. This wasn't some obscure technicality. With Clause 17, Viktor Orban's government locked in the ability to shape verdicts, block investigations, and insulate allies from prosecution. Prosecutors who tried to dig too deep found their cases reassigned or buried. Whistleblowers faced disciplinary boards stacked with party loyalists. International monitors flagged Hungary's courts as compromised, but the response from Budapest was defiance. The government pointed to the statute books and claimed everything was above board. The numbers back up the reality. Transparency International's latest Corruption Perceptions Index gives Hungary a score of 40, dead last in the EU, tied with Bulgaria. 4 years running, the country has held this position. The legal architecture is now a cage. Every safeguard of judicial independence reduced to paperwork. Every check on executive power quietly dismantled. On paper, Hungary still has courts. In practice, the law serves the people who write it. The cost isn't just measured in closed cases or silenced judges. It's a signal to the rest of Europe that, under the right regime, the rule of law is just another commodity for sale. Slovakia's backslide is not a carbon copy of Hungary's, but it is cut from the same cloth. Only this time, the target was the country's last line of defense against official wrongdoing. In October 2022, Amendment 87-2022, Clause 12, rewrote the rules for whistleblower protection. The language is surgical. The National Watchdog Agency lost its power to shield public servants who report corruption, stripping away anonymity, guarantees, and gutting the right to refuse orders that violate the law. Now, anyone who tries to flag embezzlement or political interference risks exposure, retaliation, or a dead-end career. The numbers tell the rest. Slovakia's score on the Corruption Perceptions Index has sunk to 48, a sharp drop from the days when it was lauded as a regional reformer. Watchdog reports count dozens of investigations into senior officials and organized crime that have stalled or vanished outright since the amendment passed. Prosecutors who once relied on protected testimony now face stonewalling from ministries and the abrupt closure of high-profile cases. The agency's director, once a fixture on anti-graft panels in Brussels, has been sidelined, replaced by a political appointee with no background in oversight. What started as a technical tweak has metastasized into a climate of fear. Whistleblowers are left isolated, and the message to public servants is clear: keep your head down or risk becoming collateral. The pattern is spreading. The same legal engineering that made judicial capture possible in Hungary is now being mirrored westward. One clause, one agency, one safeguard at a time. The cost is measured not just in lost cases, but in the silence that follows. Europe's corruption isn't an accident. It's policy, written into contracts and sold as reform. Today, the average Corruption Perceptions Index score, CPI, in Western Europe sits at 64, a new decade low. Golden visas still buy passports. Brussels drowns in lobbyists. The real question is, when the rules are built for insiders, who is left to trust the system? The myth of clean government is dead. Now, only exposure keeps the rot from spreading.